Thanks for listening to this podcast of Trending with Timmerie. If you haven't already subscribed, please catch us wherever you love to listen to your podcast, from the Relevant Radio app to Apple, YouTube, you name it, we are there. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to go and give us a 5-star review to help other people discover the podcast. Anything you share in terms of episodes, whether it's texting it to a friend, posting on social media, helps to build up the kingdom for God, to help confront the challenging issues we face as a culture, but with joy, with hope, and with an eternal perspective where our faith collides with everyday life, bringing eternal principles to help us live our life joyfully. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Last week, the news came out from the Biden administration endorsing for little children sex changes and hormone replacement therapy, so-called hormone replacement therapy. We know that cross-sex hormones, we've talked about it before here on Trending, given to a child prepubescently, blocks puberty, the natural development and progression of the human person. We know countless studies have shown that 9 out of 10 children who struggle with gender dysphoria, that they will work it out for themselves, choosing and accepting their biological sex, if there's no intervention, if there's no ushering them into the transgender movement and ideology. And joining me now to really touch on the impact of sex changes, so-called gender affirmation surgeries, is Dr. Patrick Lappert. He's a plastic and reconstructive surgeon. He's been with us here on Trending before. He's also a deacon in the Catholic Church. And Dr. Lappert, I'd like to hear your initial reaction to the Biden administration endorsing sex changes, top and bottom surgery for little children.
Hello, Timmerie. Thanks for having me back. Yeah, it kind of is not a surprise to me that the Biden administration has gone down this road. If you'll recall, one of the very first things that the Biden administration did was make a very public announcement about a relatively minor figure in the Health and Human Services Department as being a transgender person, who's now, of course, all over the news. But to make such an appointment, such an important part of moving into the White House, it speaks volumes as to who's guiding this administration. Now, I wouldn't lay this at the feet of President Biden, because I really doubt that he's making these decisions. But there's a great deal of healthcare money involved in this whole transgender movement. And we know, as you pointed out in your introduction to this segment, that children who are not encouraged into this gender ideology, children who are allowed to grow up as children ought to grow up and who have the support of their families, and perhaps children who may get a little therapeutic intervention and maybe some family therapy, over 90% of them will get over it by the time they move into young adulthood. But if you take those same children and you bring them into the gender clinics, they're virtually guaranteed. It approximates 100% of them who are started on a gender affirmation, social transitioning, will continue on to puberty blockade and cross-sex hormones. And by the time you've started them down that road, it's virtually guaranteed that they will come into adulthood with major changes to their bodies, to their personalities as a result of these horrible interventions. And what you have then is a lifelong dependent of the healthcare system, and massive amounts of money changes hands every time they get a child enrolled in this process. So massive healthcare dollars, big pharma, big surgery, big hospital systems, and it's being supported by some very strong and very well-funded political organizations. So
that's Dr. Patrick Lappert here on Trending with Timmerie. He's a plastic and reconstructive surgeon. And I'd like to touch on, and I know this is a sensitive topic for a lot of people, the topic of gender dysphoria. Many of us have had loved ones who've experienced gender dysphoria, might be struggling with their identity, may know someone, and we want to have a compassionate response. We want to support and encourage people, but what the Biden administration is doing goes against any research and support. The pro-gender ideology movement is trying to make claims academically in terms of research that are not held up. We do not have any clear research that, for example, a parent affirming a child in opposite gender, that this actually helps a child with their mental health. There's no research that upholds it. Actually, quite the opposite. We have many studies, one as recent as 2016 and another 2017 from Schum, Crawford, McLaughlin, Olson, various researchers affirming that parents do not improve the children's mental health when transitioning. But I want to talk about the sensitive topic, and for some, this is hard to hear. And a little warning, maybe this is something you return to later on the podcast, relevantradio.com/trending, or wherever you catch your podcasts. I want to discuss, Dr. Lappert, for those who don't understand what an actual sex change is and the difference between top and bottom surgery. If you could kind of help us in understanding the significance of it, the irreversibility, and the reality of what this means long term for an individual who goes through with this.
Okay, well, the place to begin is that there's no such thing as sex change. It's an impossibility. That terminology has been floating around for a long, long time, even since back in the early 20th century when the first surgeries were being performed. They would use that terminology, but it's scientifically quite inaccurate because you can't change somebody's sex. You can change their sex appearance by creating counterfeit structures and by destroying existing structures in an irreversible way. As you pointed out, there's the surgical interventions are divided into two major groups. There's what we call top surgery, and this includes a whole host of what I would characterize as minor procedures, everything from hair transplants to tracheal shaving and things like that to give the face a more masculine or feminine appearance. Rhinoplasty, surgery on the nose, surgery on the brow, things to feminize a face or to masculinize a face. That's in the category of top surgery. And those, for the most part, are, in a sense, reversible. On the other hand, top surgery also includes breast surgery, which the largest, newest demographic in transgender is the adolescent female who identifies as a male.
Right.
And when you're talking about top surgery in that demographic group, you're talking about irreversible mastectomy and what they call chest masculinization surgery. And, people are being misled even especially by the proponents of transgender medicine and surgery. They're being misled into believing that, well, that's reversible too. That is not reversible. All you can do if a young woman changes her mind is you can give her the appearance of breast mounds, as we do for a woman who's had mastectomy for cancer. But she doesn't have breasts. She has breast-like mounds, but she'll never be able to breastfeed, and neither will she have normal sensation from the nipple, because chest masculinization surgery permanently severs the nerve connection between the nipple and the hypothalamus of the brain, which is where the oxytocin release happens and all of the what we call erotogenic sensibility from the nipple. Intimacy. That is not recoverable. That will never come back. So essentially you have a numb chest and the destruction of the human faculty of breastfeeding, which is irreversible. And then you move on to the bottom surgery, as it's euphemistically called, and this is the irreversible genital surgery, where essentially the person is castrated, their native external genitalia are mutilated. Sometimes, for example, in the male who seeks to present as a female, his native genitalia are used as tissue to create a counterfeit vagina, which of course is not an actual reproductive structure. It's just a counterfeit.
Right.
And the female seeking to present as a male will have her form of castration is oophorectomy and vaginectomy and hysterectomy, and then the creation of a counterfeit phallus or something like that.
Just to interrupt you briefly for a moment, I know some people who are listening, we're talking about with Dr. Patrick Lappert. He's a plastic reconstructive surgeon as well as a deacon in the Catholic Church, and he's been at the forefront of helping us to understand the reality of so-called gender affirmation surgery, or what people are calling sex changes, emphasizing that there's no such thing as a sex change. There's an appearance of seemingly looking as if you are the opposite sex, but you can't actually change your sex. And he's helping us to understand what the reality of top and bottom surgery are and the manipulation of the body to create an appearance that President Biden and his administration, the LGBTQ movement, are trying to push forward as a so-called means of bringing happiness and mental health to individuals, which no research actually supports this. But it's important we understand what we're discussing with regard to so-called sex changes. You can't change your sex. Dr. Laffer, as you're talking about the castration of the native genitalia and what's actually happening, can you continue to help us understand what this is?
Well, so in essence, what is done, for example, in a female seeking to present as a male, is that she has removal of all her internal reproductive structures, which makes her a lifelong dependent on the medical system for hormonal support. And then when she's taking high doses of male hormones in an effort to masculinize her body, it will have effects on one of her native structures, the clitoris, which will become hypertrophic or overgrown, as it were. One of the common operations done to persons seeking to present as males is what's called a metoidoplasty, where that hypertrophic clitoris is surgically modified so that the urethra is lengthened at the base of that structure so that the person can urinate standing up, which is one of the commonly stated goals of women who seek to present as men, the ability to walk into a men's room and urinate standing up. So that's called a metoidoplasty. It's one of the most commonly performed genital operations in what are called female to male gender affirmation operations. The more aggressive operation is the creation of what's called a neophallus, where an entire structure is created out of tissue borrowed from elsewhere on the woman's body to create a phallus that has within it a skin-lined urethra tube, and that's transplanted like as a free flap to the area of the groin to create a counterfeit phallus, which has, of course, none of the attributes of native genitalia, but it just appears like a phallus through which the person can urinate. These are subject to frequent complications, strictures of the neourethra, leakages of the neourethra, extrusion of implanted devices that are placed in there to give the person the capacity for penetrative intercourse, infectious complications, urinary obstruction, all kinds of problems that are never spoken about in public because that's sort of the modus operandi of the surgical community that does these things.
The reality.
They give the public the impression that we're capable of producing, totally normal-looking genitalia, but we're not.
It's a hidden secret. Yeah,
it is. But if you look into the complication rate for these operations, and I've had to do that because I do expert testimony on this matter, the complication rate, depending on the particular operation chosen, is fairly high. And what you're looking at, of course, is a lifelong problem now of managing the urinary tract, of managing implanted devices.
As we confront this crisis surrounding an ideology of gender dysphoria that is damaging, there is no research that supports the claim such as that a so-called sex change, you can't change your sex, that a so-called sex change improves mental health, nor that it reduces suicide. There is no research that supports it. The LGBTQ community is falsely making this claim, and this is one of those moments as people of faith, as people who can use our capacity to reason, this is a part of being a human person, we have to dissect what we are hearing, even when the highest levels of administrations in the United States or political bodies or medical bodies claim otherwise. And so Dr. Patrick Lapper is here to help us understand the truth and the reality of what so-called sex change is, the reality that, as you mentioned a moment ago, Dr. Lapper, that with the trend predominantly of girls wanting to be boys, that we're talking about the complete removal of their reproductive system, never being able to regain the capacity to reproduce. And you talk about a 13 or 9-year-old or 15-year-old girl today who's coming out and taking cross-sex hormones and then is going through with top and bottom surgery. She will never have children. And our president of the United States is endorsing this type of permanent mutilation of the body. Not only that, but recommending what is essentially, no one talks about this, but you mentioned it, she will have to be on cross-sex hormones for her life because her reproductive system has been damaged and removed. And so as you share the reality of top and bottom surgery, and if you're just joining us, it's graphic, it's hard to hear. It reminds me of when the pro-life movement first started to describe what abortion is. And people, even who are pro-life, didn't want to hear it. But we need to understand what we are fighting against. And so if you missed that conversation, I hope you'll go back, relevantradio.com/trending, and subscribe and listen to this podcast. But Dr. Lapper, as a plastic and reconstructive surgeon and a deacon in the Catholic Church, you really draw together how God got it right when he made a plan for the human person and our bodies and the complementarity. Can you speak as a plastic surgeon and a deacon, how you've seen the fusion in the function of the body, and even when there's confusion with so-called gender, the gift and the longevity of staying in your body as a good thing that actually helps us long term?
Well, right. So this has been at the heart of our understanding of the nature of the human person. Just for the longest time now, it's fundamental to our Catholic understanding of what it means to be a human person, that we have a single nature, that we are body and soul together comprising a single nature. It's not that we have a soul nature, that it's a body that carries a soul around, which is one of the great errors of this whole transgender mentality, and it, in fact, is quite diabolical. It's a diabolical mistake. We are body and soul comprising a single nature. And that's at the heart of the mistake of transgenderism, is because it divorces the person, it divides the person and causes people to think of themselves as being fundamentally a spirit creature that possesses a body, which is a heretical thing, and it's contrary to the revealed truth of the human person. And so people speak these days about their bodies as being something they possess over which they can exercise dominion. And that is, if you believe that, then the incarnation of Jesus Christ makes absolutely no sense. And his atoning work on the cross is no longer efficacious. Because if you can divide the person that way, then the one who hung on the cross was not really a human being. He was just God appearing to be a human being, and therefore nothing was affected on the cross for our salvation. So this is not a small peripheral issue. This is at the heart of the war, the spiritual warfare that humanity is subject to right now, and to delude children into believing that transgenderism is a reality. Is a horrible thing. It's a heretical thing because it goes contrary to who we know that Jesus Christ is and he revealed to us who we are. So at the heart of the whole transgender idea is the idea that body and soul are somehow separate and still human, and that's not the case. That's not the case. We are body and soul together comprising a single nature. And that's really what's at the heart, from the Catholic perspective, that's what's at the heart of this thing. And it's such a horrific crime against humanity to get people, particularly children, believing that somehow they're in the wrong body, as if that's even a possibility, as if their body is something separate from their personal identity or their self. So it's a terrible heretical lie that the whole world is being subjected to now, and in particular, children are vulnerable to this kind of thinking. And so when a child is suffering, and they're offered this explanation, they'll jump on it. They'll jump on it, believing that if they go down that road of transgender self-identification, that somehow they're going to find happiness on the other side. Well, the fact is that the whole idea is contrary to human nature, because human nature, it's a single nature, body and soul together, comprising one nature, one identity. And
the culture ultimately is trying to be compassionate, where we're trying to offer a solution or help or aid to someone who is suffering. But a culture of compassion doesn't mean endorsing LGBTQ ideology across sex hormones or a so-called sex change. You can't change your sex. So what we believe what we know about the truth of male and femaleness, we need to tell the truth. And we need to help people understand that the pursuit of who you are as a woman and who you are as a man will make you happy. That's Dr. Patrick Lappert. Joining me now is licensed marriage and family therapist Michael Gasparo. He is an expert in responding to the gender crisis today, especially from a therapeutic perspective. He's very well informed on the real research surrounding gender dysphoria and same-sex attraction, as well as having his own testimony as well. And when I listened to the comments from President Biden last week, encouraging children to identify as transgender, using God to invoke and encourage a transgender idea, and using a lack of science, actually no science and anything from the academy whatsoever, to encourage parents to encourage children to transition. I thought no better person than Michael Gasparo to dive into this topic. Michael, I'd like to walk through President Biden's brief video that he made last week. Welcome to Trending. It's good to have you.
Always good to be here, Timmery. I wish we were talking about something more positive coming from the Oval Office, but here we are.
Here we are, and I think it's important, especially as Catholics, to respond, especially when God is being invoked in this. So President Biden begins by referring to a beautiful truth that the human person, especially including anyone struggling with transgenderism, that they're made in the image of God, deserving dignity, respect, and support. And we can 100% agree on that perspective. But I think the challenge is that we differ in our approach of how to do that.
Amen. And I love that we're starting out with how we can build a bridge from what he said that was good. I mean, he said, made in the image of God, and they're deserving of dignity and respect and support. And that is right out of the playbook of the Catholic Catechism. What is not is the idea that affirming a specifically transgender identity is the best way to reinforce that dignity we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And he right away goes into addressing so-called anti-transgender laws, making it sound as if people who believe in not teaching 3-year-olds to 8-year-olds, such as in the state of Florida, about LGBTQ ideas and lifestyles, or giving cross-sex hormones to children in the state of Texas, as has been outlawed in Texas, that is harmful and damaging to children. But the research, Michael, actually tells a different story. There's no academic research supporting cross-sex hormones or LGBTQ education for children today.
Yeah, and what President Biden said is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep your child safe and healthy is to affirm their identity. Well, I agree with him, but what identity are we affirming? And Dr. Christopher Kaiser out of LMU, who is an expert on the research of happiness, who's been on Trending with Timmery, has talked with me personally about the human person flourishes when their core identity is based on the most stable principles possible. And nothing is more stable than our intrinsic worth as established by God's loving us into being, his love for us. Being made in his image and likeness is an identity that we should affirm in our children, which will keep them safe and healthy. The idea that affirming their fluid, confused understanding of sexuality and their awareness of their biology is the best way to keep them safe and healthy is absurdity. Mm-hmm. Thoughts and feelings about your body that are not reflective of reality, of biological reality, should not be affirmed as the core aspect of your human identity.
It's interesting because you noted something so important, and I just want to play for a moment those words from President Biden telling parents to tell kids the lie of encouraging a transgender ideology. Listen to this. It comes off as so compassionate, so kind, but it's a lie. There's no research to support it.
To parents of transgender children, affirming your child's identity is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep them safe and healthy.
This statement, so simple, packs a lot of weight when coming from someone so high as a president of the United States, and even coming from policies that he's implementing on the highest level from people who are supposed to be experts. But the reality is Michael, you just point to the fact that this is basing a child's identity on instability. And the most stable and best thing you can do for a child, for any human being, is to root and ground their lives on something that is real, concrete, that is understandable. And when we talk about gender dysphoria, it's an idea, it's a theory. It enters into a fantasy world that doesn't tell the truth, just like we wouldn't encourage someone who believes that they're missing a limb to continue to live as if they were missing a limb. This is the same level that psychology has approached gender dysphoria for years, to tell the truth and to help stabilizing an identity, not destabilize it with a lie, which is what President Biden is encouraging.
And research does not support what he's saying either. Affirming parents, i.e., parents who reinforce their child's delusional belief that they are not in the right body, does not actually improve the mental health of children. And to further this idea, he's implying that we should have medical options available to children to permanently alter their bodies, which we both know, Timmer, you and I have discussed at length, are at the age where we don't even let them choose what they want to eat every day, because we know their nutrition is our responsibility for helping keep them safe.
Oh, it's fascinating. And the reality is that the research points to the fact that, especially coming out of Finland and countless studies, but Finland gives the example that for many kids who are experiencing gender dysphoria, there's usually an onset of some psychopathology preceding gender dysphoria. And the research shows that most kids who experience gender dysphoria, as you well know because you work with people who are struggling with this, that they have other comorbidities, everything from various types of addiction, OCD, past sexual abuse. Can you speak to this and the fact that there's no academic research that backs up President Biden's claim to live a transgender lifestyle and for a parent to affirm this as a so-called best thing for a child?
Around 90% of children with gender dysphoria will resolve their gender dysphoric concerns even if left untreated. That means on their own, 90%, as estimated across most research, will resolve these feelings of gender dysphoria into adulthood. That shows that feelings and thoughts of gender dysphoria are very unstable, hence why they form a terrible basis for somebody's core identity, one of many reasons why. Second of all, even if somebody does have persistent and consistent gender dysphoria from childhood into adulthood, a delusion is a fixed false belief. And the belief that you are born in the wrong body is a delusion. And good mental health means living in reality. We should not encourage pathology out of compassion. So it is more compassionate to affirm somebody's core identity made in the image of God and help them reduce their suffering with gender dysphoria than it is to affirm a fixed false belief that leads them further away from living in the reality of their biological truth given to them as a gift by God.
I want to come actually to that specific debate in just a moment. The idea that God can make someone gay or transgender, that you're made that way or born that way. We'll touch on that in a moment. But before we go there, Michael, I think it's important that we know some of the academic research that emphasizes that cross-sex hormones, sex changes, top or bottom surgery, as well as a therapy that affirms transgenderism, none of this actually supports the decrease in suicidality. In fact, it actually shows an increase in completed suicidality, but no one's telling the truth about that. So what Biden is claiming has no academic, psychological, or physical research support to back what he's saying.
And some of the research support that comes out in favor of things like the Equality Act, which President Biden mentioned, is often highly unethical or dishonest as well. And I would like to call attention to some great Catholic researchers like Father Dr. Father Paul Sullins out of Catholic University of America and his work at the Ruth Institute. If your listeners want to go check out some of his work, he takes some of these quote unquote conversion therapy studies that highlight the harm of therapies to try to help use evidence-based talk therapy to help people reduce their dysphoria or reduce their same-sex attractions. And he uses the data provided by far left liberal institutes like the Williams Institute, and he shows that they misrepresent even at times the data they're collecting to emphasize fear tactics like suicidality. Nobody is trying to encourage suicidality. Everyone's on the same page. These individuals, transgender individuals who identify as transgender or LGBT identified individuals, are deserving of love, compassion, sensitivity, respect, and no one from the Catholic side is encouraging them to harm themselves. So we need to push back and keep on the offensive that we have good solutions. We have compassionate care we can offer through talk therapy, through family support, through medical support, and that does not have to include puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or horrible surgeries that disfigure young people.
That's Michael Gasparo, licensed marriage and family therapist, today on Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio. I'm Timmerie. Michael, one of the claims that is being made often in society with the rise of gender dysphoria and same-sex attraction is that people are born that way, that God made you that way, that God makes someone gay. And that argument is being used especially in light of President Biden invoking his faith, God, while trying to affirm people who are suffering from same-sex attraction, gender dysphoria. What does the research say about the claim of being born gay and that God makes you that way?
Well, what's great and what's very interesting is that there are some honest academic leading researchers from the American Psychological Association, such as Dr. Lisa Diamond, who we've discussed before, who has an interesting TED Talk from the year 2018 called Why the Born This Way Argument Does Not Advance LGBT Rights or Equality. And she first and foremost highlights in her talk, and she's an open lesbian who researches heterosexual and homosexual issues related to sexual fluidity, as she calls it. And she says, saying born this way, or in other words, that your sexuality is genetically determined, is not scientifically accurate and therefore is a lie, and it should not be used to perpetuate or further gay rights. Well, we can agree with her on one thing. It's a lie. And so in that regard, the APA, the biggest group of psychologists in the world, take that for what it's worth, admit in their own frequently asked question sections on LGBT identities that orientations of the sexual minority type, LGBT, etc., are a result of a complex combination likely of nature and nurture, but environment, we know through human genome studies, plays a much bigger factor than genetics do at all in the development of sexuality, gender identity, etc. So we need to keep this in mind. Science is revealing the truth that we are not born with a set prefixed sexual identity that fits into the LGBTQ arena. What we can really emphasize, though, is that people don't choose intentionally, oftentimes, their gender dysphoric issues. They don't choose to have sexual attraction to the same sex or any other kinds of sexual issues. But what they need is hope, compassion, care, and to be reminded that for some people, as they address underlying issues which influenced the development of their ego-dystonic sexuality, i.e., things that they don't want in their life, unwanted feelings or behaviors, many people experience healing that results in a shift away from those feelings and behaviors, or increased peace about their sense of self and ability to live according to their Catholic conscience. And that is a message of hope that does not get shared enough.
And from a faith-filled perspective, we have to have a theological, anthropological approach to the human person, Michael, because we are people of faith. God created the human person. He has a purpose for the human person. And a fundamental element of our theology, Michael, is that we are created as human beings in the image and likeness of God. And with that means to be made in God's image and likeness, we are made for love. We're made to be like God in his capacity to love. And that means we have intellect and free will, because in order to love, you have to be able to know something, come to know it, and freely choose it. Well, to say that you're born gay goes fundamentally against the revelation of the church that the human person is created in God's image and likeness with intellect and free will. And that would violate the idea that you do have free action. Even if you experience a temptation, that doesn't mean you have to act on it. And I think that that's at the heart of our theology and our approach in the church, that just because we suffer, we struggle, we do need to receive compassion and help and resources, but we don't need to be told a lie or ushered into a lifestyle that goes against the very definition of the human person. Michael, thank you so much for joining us and helping to shed light on the truth and the resources available to help people who are struggling with gender dysphoria and same-sex attraction. What's the best place for someone to go to briefly if you were to throw out a website?
Yeah, come visit me on CatholicTherapist.com, but also go to the Ruth Institute. There's great Catholic research there. I'll send a link and you'll post it at the show notes.
Perfect. We'll include a link in the podcast notes as well on social media. Follow us at relevantradio.com/trending or wherever you catch your podcast.